as I've looked and compared typologies, houses from the north and the south, I am very much convinced that in most of the settlements in Egypt, we can certainly make out a standard house layout. Obviously, for it needs a particular size, needs a particular also wealth and status to realize such a house layout standard. So I would totally agree that the plan is actually from the beginning. This concept is there, but how those different rooms are then used and also used changes over time, and different rooms are used for crafting, for sleeping, for eating, for I totally agree with this, but I still think that the plan that we see, so this initial idea of how you would build this particular house, also what Ido said, it's not so much about maybe a traditional building technique in the Levant with the stone foundations and the mud brick walls, but it's about, first of all, this layout that is important, how this is then adapted also over the years. And I would agree with Linda, the longer obviously a space is occupied, and Neal showed this nice example how then maybe a neighboring house is being included, integrated, maybe some doors are closed off, new spaces are opened. All of this certainly happens the longer you occupy the space. But I still would like to see this like initial plan for most of those houses, actually.
I suppose one of the things to think about in terms of Miriam's comment on, the initial intention of a plan is to be realistic about how achievable that is. So one of the things we're finding at Amara West is that often you are hemmed in on one side by another house, or you have a wall there, or there's some environmental, there might be a river channel or an area where water collects seasonally and so on. And so that causes quite, at a plan level, it can look very different. It doesn't mean it was necessarily used differently or felt differently. But yeah, I would just kind of, I suppose, emphasize that even from the start, there are already things beginning to kind of make dissonance in the kind of general patterns.
And the best known Egyptian center in the South Levant is Bet Shan, that you can see in the upper right-hand side of the screen, overlooking the huge Roman Byzantine period city of Skytopolis. And before looking at the archaeological remains, I would like to point a few issues. First, you can see on the bottom right-hand side a photo of the landscape around Bet Shan. It's a semi-arid part of the southern Levant. You don't get too much rain in this part of the country. And it might resemble a bit the Egyptians, their homeland, maybe in a bit. And this is the most famous similar region in the southern Levant besides the region of Gaza. The second issue is the limits of the evidence. This is the only site where real Egyptian houses can be identified across the southern Levant, across the 400 years of Egyptian colonialism in the southern Levant. And the third issue is the problems in identifying Egyptians in the record, mainly because starting from the mid-18th dynasty and during the 19th and 20th dynasty, a major portion of the administration was probably manned by Canaanites or people of Canaanite descent that served the administration in Canaan, and this might also trigger the problems in identifying Egyptians in the material record. I'd like to add regarding the typology of houses. In the 80s, there was a search for governor residences in the southern Levant, and several papers were published about it. And then the reaction was that, well, these ones have basalt foundation. These ones is not exactly an Egyptian plan, blueprint. And then they were all, or many of them were turned to be Canaanite houses all of a sudden. But I think that the point that you raised, Linda, is fascinating, because the fact that the governor says, build me a house, this is how it should look like, It didn't really care perhaps about the materials or the foundations or the fact that some variations might exist in the rooms in the house, as long as you get the functions that are needed for them in their very remote place where they live with very few Egyptians around them.
Certainly important to think about the different climate, the different environment in the various regions. And we do see some specific regional adaptations where it's actually very different from other parts in Egypt. For example, Elephantine is always also mentioned as an example where we do not see so many parallels with other sites, with other settlements, for example. So I think it's really important to keep in mind this regional aspect also. I know that you're really interested, obviously, also in what's happening inside the house, outside the house. I find it very difficult since we do not have what Neal also said, those communal spaces in a way. So we can't really talk about what's happening outside at a market, for example, or what kind of shops, for example, what we have there. It's so difficult already to pinpoint maybe different functions in a house. On the other hand, it's super difficult to differentiate between an office space, for example, and a residential space. So it's very difficult to really differentiate those activities there inside, outside.
I could amplify some of that in many ways. I would argue for atomizing it even further, and starting to think about individual places, sites is different. So I like the idea of building up room and then house biographies, and then you look at a neighborhood, and then you start to look at how a town changed over time. And we're finding Amara West in 1300 BC is very different from Amara West in 1050 BC. But it's also throughout that, it seems, as far as we can tell, different from Sai, from Solo. Sorry, we don't have Solo, but Sesame, and the houses there. And it reminds us how little we know. There just aren't enough of these sites that have been excavated or have the preservation. But I think the kind of, again, going back to that issue I have with terms like temple towns, is that yes, there is a temple in these towns, but it tends to give us a sense that they're all the same. And they're actually developing along very different trajectories, the towns as well as the different components within them. So I think you may well have a point that there's likely to be more consistency between, say, Upper Egypt and Nubia, but Lower Nubia is very different from Upper Nubia. In Upper Nubia, it's very different where we are, or where we were at Amara West, to compare to the Dongola Reach. And you see that in the architecture of the houses today. They're different. There's some commonalities, of course, but there's differences. So I would say we're a long way off understanding the regional patterns, because we don't yet understand the city by city patterns. And I mean, Amarna has been very well studied, and a number of other sites. And then there's the whole question of regionalism, isn't there, and what the rural sites look like. And there's increasingly work in that domain in Nubia,